thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to give you a little story about what it is that I've been doing for the last 50-something years. Jen?
Do you want me to hit the lights?
Yeah, I can do that. When I was in college, I started a business. And I started making reproductions of wood carvings and stone carvings. And this original was on a desk that I bought around the college. They were doing urban redevelopment, and somebody was selling a lot of stuff. And I bought a desk and had all these great carvings on it. So I bought the desk, pried off the carvings, and left the desk. Somehow a friend of mine was making rubber molds. I made a rubber mold on it. So this is a copy of the original wood carving. And I was so good at it that you couldn't tell which was the original, which was the fake. Am I making that noise? And so my mother-in-law at that time, for my first marriage, said, oh, and she was a designer. And she worked for some company. She said, I bet I could sell this stuff to the company. And I was making these in our kitchen. I was living in student housing, paying $28 a month rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. And
where was this?
this is in Detroit.
Oh, okay.
And she got me a $300 order. And I said, wow, this is great. And it started this little business that I started in Detroit. After I graduated, we moved to New York. And this piece is from a building that's near, it's on 18th Street and Irving Place. And during the 4th of July, everybody was away. Everybody was away on vacation. I went over there with a little ladder and made a mold on the building. So and then I started doing frames and started working with mirror. Jen? I ended up opening up a store on 6th Avenue between 12th and 13th Street called Gargoyles. And I started playing with mirror and unusual framing, and then I got interested in bent glass and curved mirror because it was really interesting to me. And I used to go. There used to be glass bending facilities in New York, Manhattan itself, and I used to buy stuff from them. Jen. So this is kind of some of the stuff, and it's interesting. On eBay, people are selling these. I've seen a couple of those, and it's got my name on the back, and they talk about this famous artist, his early work. So that's been interesting. Jen? This was at the first Earth Day, and I had made this mirror sandwich board, and I had once before I had walked up Fifth Avenue to Rockefeller Center, reflecting people's images at them. And this was mentioned in...
Is that you?
That's me.
Yeah. That's you.
I was in the long hair days. This is probably 19th...
S. Klein.
Yeah.
I remember it.
Earth Day, 1970, maybe in 1970.
I think it was 1970.
Jen? Oh, something interesting about, hold off for a second. Interesting about that, in the Neue Glass magazine, that photograph was put in there, and before I was in, at that time I just did something it was far out. These days it's a performance piece. So this is a little bit the gargoyles. I think we're going to just pass this one by. There's, Jen? No, we're not going to do this.
Okay.
This is a costume I made. This was at the American Craft Museum one day when they had invited people to wear costumes.
You're right on stage.
Yeah, that's an Elton John kind of thing.
Jen?
You'd be perfect for that.
And this is when I started to bend sheets of glass and have them mirrored because I was interested in the kind of reflection that was happening and the movement that was happening. Because if you moved it, the reflection got really strange and it was very hippie-ish. And I liked it. A lot of photographers took some interesting photos with these. Okay, right.
Ah,
Okay. This was from the first, one of the things that happened with those mirrors, I kept making mistakes. This was at a time before they had computer-controlled kilns. And I used to wear a timer, a kitchen timer attached to my shirt, so I would remember to go back there in time. But sometimes maybe I was at Canal Street, I had a studio in Tribeca. And the mistakes that happened led me to start playing with form. And this was a show in 1972 with Ivan Karp in Soho. This is my apartment in a drawing studio that I had. I had an apartment on 2nd Avenue, a rent-controlled apartment between 2nd Avenue, between 32nd and 33rd.
So the long hair is gone?
The long hair, yeah, in the early 1970s, I cleaned up my hair. Okay.
Lost your shoes.
This is fabulous.
After that show of glass sculpture with Ivan Karp, I realized I hadn't had art training. There was stuff I needed to know. When I went to college, I ended up with a degree in mathematics and a minor in French. I was given permission to go every place in the hospital, and the head surgeon loved my drawings. They would go up, some of them would go up around in the hospital, not things like this usually, but he had me in there in mask and gown, right next to the operating table. He positioned me so it wouldn't be this way. And it was the kind of thing that couldn't happen today. I mean, with the insurance climate, just
Can't get in.
you couldn't do it. And I don't know what anybody was thinking, it was just different. So that was pretty interesting to me. And I was also having more formal portraits with people. They would come to my drawing studio and sit for me. And sometimes they were performing. A lot of times.
Is this, is this paint, oil, watercolor, charcoal?
These are drawings in pencil or pastel. I was often drawing in pencil, and I was coloring in with pastel often that was ground, and then I would use something like a Q-tip so I could put very light coloration on.
So far, no formal training. This is all on your own.
This is all just doing it.
I think they're
And
extraordinary.
in the years, in the decade of the 70s, when I was drawing people all the time, I actually got pretty good at it. I
There
was,
was one in the center or something.
I think you're extraordinary.
one of my sons said to me, "How'd you learn to draw?" I said, "You just do it. You do it." And it was something that I was just living. I was drawing like I was breathing.
Are they from photographs or from models?
No, there was people would sit for me. They would come, yeah.
Did you have to pay them?
No, everybody was honored to have their portraits out. Really.
You still do it at all?
Hmm?
You still do it?
Once in a while, my kids and I will sit for each other, but I don't. I do portraits in another way these days. It's like, this is Lola Pejelinski, and this is her in some performance, and then she came and she sat for me. I can't remember, this is either a dancer, I can't remember who it is. That's David, He's from Detroit. I can't remember his name right now. He's an actor, you know. Okay. And this is Brendon Murray, and this was, you know, a formal portrait I did of them. I did them separately, and then I joined it all together. And maybe we're going to see. Recently, I just did portraits of them again, which was great in the new way that I do that stuff. Jen? And at this point, when I was drawing, I wasn't doing as much glass work, and then in the late 70s, I had a dream about this form. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting, looks interesting. Let me see if I can make it. So I went into the studio, and pretty soon I was able to actually do it. So this form became like a keystone of what I started to do. Where this was made with a piece of flat glass that was a triangle laid over wires, and the points on the triangle would drip down slowly and then elongate and make these feet all by itself. You know, gravity did it. And I just watched it and had to know what was going to happen and control it and stop it at the right time.
Where did you do it?
I had the studio in Tribeca.
Oh, you're in
And
studio.
so I had a studio there, I had a couple of kilns there. I wanted to do something, I tried to do something every day in the kiln. So I came back the next day, it was cool enough, I cut it loose, and I did something new that day.
Is that pink on the bottom? Is it a pinkish color?
This is, it's a white flash, and there's what's underneath the pinkish, there was some kind of John Mansell board that I would use underneath that had asbestos in it, and it was great. And I didn't know, I didn't know, but it wasn't so powdery, but sometimes on the bottom, they would stick to the bottom.
You're still here.
Huh?
You're still here.
I'm still here, yeah. So that's another form that I did. And so I was experimenting with what can I do with this? How can I develop it? What can it turn into? And these were fragile objects, and they needed to be protected. So I was building glass boxes around them and making these environments to give them some kind of meaning. And so this has the flutex in there with patterns behind, so there's different kinds of movement would happen within the box. And I was playing tennis a lot, that's called Love 40. And that's a hanging piece with a box in there.
Who was winning?
I think I was. And here I was using a heavier glass with heavier, before I was using nichrome wire. Somehow there was a wire place in Tribeca across from my studio, and he sold me some nichrome wire. And it turns out the coefficient of expansion of nichrome wire is close to that of glass, so that it didn't break the glass. Here, this is steel coated with a zinc coating on it, like fencing. And what happens is that when you heat it up, the zinc coating bubbles up and makes a shell. And so when everything cools off, there's a little bit of space for the glass to contract. And I was interested in what I could do with it. So both of these forms were totally filled with layers of glass, and then I heated it until it was coming
sold
sold
off. Are these in galleries sold off?
Some of them are in galleries, some of them are still in my archives.
I got one.
You have one?
I got one.
This is some more kind of an experimentation, and it was regularly I would think up some other way to do this and see what I could do with it. This, I love wire glass. This is the kind of glass that you probably originally saw in elevators. It was like so it wouldn't shatter if there was a fire. And here it's heated up so much that the glass is dripping off the wire and forming the legs. I was wrapping up a lot of layers of glass and heating them up. This is, the glass form was made, I was making it originally at a place called Architectural Glass in Beacon, and then I would reform it.
How big is that?
Maybe about 12 inches tall. And I just played with stuff. You know, I had this material I could work with. You know, I could make something if we needed something. Okay.
Those are nice.
Those are nice.
Some bigger pieces. This won an award, a Felicimo Design Award. I got $5,000 and 1,000 colored pencils.
That's fabulous.
I know.
I ended up doing the whole bathroom in that glass. Yeah.
That is really cool.
Oh, that is really different.
So that's a bowl, and it's hollow, but it's interesting that you can see the stuff inside in that distortion. And this was outside in our backyard, and it was out there for about 9 years, and it was glued to another glass plate in the ground, and it was a silicone that wasn't glued enough, and at some point it got during the middle of the storm it got knocked over. But it was when the sun would be in there, it would catch it and it would be exciting. So I was drawing during those times. This is like some experimenting with a foam brush. You know, those little foam brushes. And this is some of the Flutex kinetic work.
And when was that?
This is in the 80s. Okay, can you run that? So,
Yeah,
okay.
it's working.
Can we turn up the sound at all? And it isn't crucial. Hello, I'm Sidney Cash, and 30 years ago, I was making these optically kinetic wall sculptures that are made out of industrial glass and paper patterns. And when they're mounted on the wall, and you walk in front of them, the imagery changes. We're going to show you a few of those pieces now. You know, I was fascinated with this stuff. A curator looked at this stuff when I was archiving a couple years ago, and she said, "Oh my God, this is pre-internet art." and it has this sense of something you can see on the internet these days.
Where's this glass coming from?
It's industrial glass, and I used to get it because I had a relationship with a lot of commercial glazers, and when they left Soho or Tribeca, they were throwing away tons of glass. And they said, "Sidney, take whatever you want. We got to put it in. We got to pay to get rid of it."
Look at this.
last year, I donated 3,000 square feet of glass to Urban Glass because I have been using it. This was an installation in New York University's Broadway Windows Gallery on 10th and Broadway. And some of this was shown actually, some of these pieces at Heller Gallery 2 years ago in a show that I had in their windows. This got a lot of attention. And then the next kind of work that I was doing, I started silk screening some of the fine line imagery that I had been generating onto sheet glass, and I would use it to construct these crystalline objects. So we get another. I especially like the way the pieces here are mounted because there's a long run on it. I mean, the approach is like 100 feet, and you can really see a lot of movement in approaching that 100 feet. And I've been archiving for a couple of years. A lot of this stuff had been packed up, and I didn't even know what was in the boxes. So it was great to have an iPhone that you take a picture of and take video of it. And it was all, you didn't even think about it. And my assistants, you know how to do it, and then they made a video. It's great. We got pretty good at silk screening stuff. I mean, we use a lot of examples, and sometimes we use silk screening sheets of glass that are 4 feet by 5 feet. It was serious work.
Did you do another work the same as
Most of it, not everything. Some of the things I had were cast. That piece was in the show here. And that's about 6 feet tall.
Wow.
Okay. This was a commission in Nashville, Tennessee. Oh, this is something that if I had an idea and I thought I could do something, I just did it. I started throwing glass, hot glass, molten glass in the air, and it made squiggly linear stuff that you couldn't make it if you were trying to do it by hand. By throwing it in there, the forces of gravity and whatever was going on, energy, made all these interesting shapes. I was doing this at Urban Glass. I'd come home with all these squiggly pieces of glass. I'd paint them, spray paint them black, or not, and then make some kind of relief in a glass frame.
That's very interesting.
And what I liked is, not only did you get that line, so you often got the shadows too that were involved in it. I started using a lot of characters in my work at one point. And I would like to kind of, I was doing some bioenergetic therapy and using my dreams. And I was making dream-like stuff. And so anything was game. And anything, it was like whatever I could imagine, let's do it. What about this? And it was fun to play with, bringing things from all different parts of my world together to make something. This is about 1996. I did a couple of years working with wire. So this has a mirror behind it, a flat mirror. So the back of that, what looks like the back of that vase, is just reflection in there.
Is it three-dimensional?
No, it's not. It's just, it's flat with wires in the front, but it gives it that three-dimensional. And this is plugged into that sense of wonder. What the hell's going on? That really intrigues me, because it gives it some sense of something magical, something engaging. It asks you to look. What am I seeing? And seeing has been so fundamental to everything that I do. That's this was, I got commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art to do a collection of optical vases, and these are, it was this size, that size, and another size in red, black, and white, and they made 18,000 of them.
Wow.
And they sold them through their design stores, and I got a nice commission.
When was that?
This is 1970.
Wow.
No, 1990. Oh, man, it was 2000, sorry. It's hard to remember all this stuff. Okay, Jen. This is a commission from the New York Transit Authority. This is Queensboro Plaza elevated subway station. And there are 16 windows, panels like that along there with that optical stuff that have some movement as you're walking on the platform.
Which station is that?
Queensboro Plaza.
Queensboro.
I started working with those boxes using mirrors that came in, that were joined in the back of the box. So you can see how you see that totally around. Well, there's only one section of it. There's only one of these. This doesn't go completely around. There's just a section, and this is the front. Jen, let's take a look at one of the sides.
Are those shells? Are those shells?
No, they're fava beans. This is another one, and so you can see, here's the line from the mirror, so the reflection of this guy is over here. This was from my bar mitzvah cake, and this is,
Suggestive.
yes, this was called, what's it called? Personal celebration. And this young little boy is sitting there with some holy book with an erection underneath.
That's funny.
Okay?
That's it.
Do we go
You
two?
saved that when you were 13?
He was thinking about it. He wasn't bold enough to speak it. This is a period when I injured my hand, and I was having problems for quite a while. And I ended up taking glass and breaking it, and and making these paintings. I break the glass over a sheet of paper and spray paint, and I capture that broken quality. And the studio has often been a place for me to figure out what has meaning, or what I can do with my problem at hand. You know, how can I give it some form so I can digest it, metabolize it? Some drawings. I did a lot of squiggle drawings at one period. And these are paintings that are spray paintings. And I was spray painting with white on black paper, and I put objects on the paper. And I got really good. What I loved about it, they were like photographs, and they were like dimensional. So, and I really did some, I think, interesting work. This was done with rubber bands.
Oh.
This was, I laid on pieces of okra, thank you. And this was just some blocks. And depending on how I used the white paint, I could, you know, there was a sense of the modeling of the piece, which I loved. They felt like they were sculptors' paintings. These are some characters. I was taking oil paint and what do we call these books? Paper doll stuff. And putting between two pieces of glass and a piece of paper as a background and squeezing it so that the oil paint got mushed into forms. And I had a jewelry business. At one point, I had been making jewelry and giving it away. And at one point, I decided, oh, let's make it into a business. And it became actually quite a viable business at one period.
Yes.
And it was great.
That's cool.
And it was fun, and then what I ended up figuring out is that I had assistants who could do a lot of the production, and I had more time for my studio work. Oh, and these are paperweights. At one point I was doing paperweights. And so they had this optical quality that was interesting. Oh, is this a video? Might be. Oh, yeah.
Douglas, I've got some paperweights that I just opened up.
So, you know, it was like the work that interested me, only smaller.
Exhibition.
A collector on the West Coast who had some finance company had me make 40 of these kind of things, whatever I wanted, any experiments to give away to clients one year. Oh, and this is another one of the light sculptures. This is an installation at a jazz club in Marlborough, New York. Okay, can you let that play? I think this might. At one point in that club, I did the whole back of the stage, and we had, it turns out that there were these controls, so I had 3 banks of light, and I could control it so that the lights played with the musicians, and it was like, you know, a hippie light show. It was cooler.
There's no music?
No music, but you get some sense of what can go on. Good. Whoops. So these are a couple of, some more light sculptures. And again, it was something that I was discovering what I could do as I did it. Because nobody else has been playing with glass mirror panels in this way. This is at the Orlando Museum, our museum. These are, at one point I started making paintings. It was that same black paper I was spray painting on, only I was pouring paint through a little baggie like the tip to make these forms. And was interested in something called the narcissistic shell in the egoic structure, and I was trying to give it form. And so this is what I was playing with. And then I started doing this work where I put oil paint on paper and I started pulling away part of the paint to make imagery.
Excuse me, was that all red underneath? And
It was
then
all red
black, and
underneath.
it's like those crayon things where you erase
Scratch
it.
away.
It's something like that,
Yeah.
right. And so this piece is mounted here in the shell.
It's on, yeah, it's on.
I started using this same process on historical portraits, and what I call my remastered portraits. And all of a sudden I was able to deal with other artists' portraits from historically and make them into something a little more contemporary and reflecting my aesthetic. And this was very exciting for me. And then at one point I started using some photographers' portraits, and then I started using my own portraits that I would take of people, and I would do something like that. Let's see if how many goes. So these are Richard Avedon's portraits. That's his father over there, and this is a beekeeper. And it was just interesting to me to do it, and somebody says, you can't use Richard Avedon's photographs. And I said, I'm doing it. And I ended up actually, I contacted the Richard Avedon Foundation to let them know what I was doing. And I also contacted Lawyers for the Arts, and they said, what you're doing, you're changing it enough that there's not a problem. So these are a couple photographs that contemporary photographs here. And I was having so much fun with the framing also.
Yeah.
Oh, so we're getting a little closer. This is a couple years ago. This is about 4 feet by 4 feet. And what I became interested in is non-rectilinear framing. And so I could make the paper as a collage thing, and then I was able to cut an aluminum substrate to exactly match it and mount it onto that. This is, like seeing how far I can move this kind of technique to what it can turn into. Maybe we're pretty close to the end. Uh-oh. There's this book called Figure Drawing for All It's Worth. It was published in 1943, and I can't remember his name right now. But somebody gave me that book, and I loved the information, especially the text. And I started cutting out the figures and putting my paintings behind it and making a collage, because it felt like the paintings energetically, they seem appropriate to the body. And this was exciting, another exciting discovery adventure that went on for a while. Even this is the text, ideal proportion female, is pretty hilarious. What they said in 1943.
Yeah.
These are some pieces from this year. where in the cutting out, I was using a circle cutter. So I could sometimes, all I had to do was rotate or interchange because they were the same circles. And a lot of interesting energy is there for me. And just that little bit of extension, I like that non-rectilinear form.
And you get along the way.
None, just about. When I was 8 years old, they had me, some teacher got me connected with the Detroit Institute of Arts, and my mother would bring me down there on a Saturday morning, and I don't know, I can't remember what we did, but we did something. The training was, I made model airplanes and all kinds of models as a kid. My parents knew that I was good with my hands, so by the time I was 6 years old, I had a workbench with a pegboard in the basement. You know, pegboard for the tools. So that was training. And anytime anybody would come, like a plumber or a carpenter, I was right there watching to see what they did. And I took every industrial arts class I could in middle school. And when I went to high school, technical high school, I majored in aeronautics. And so there were a lot of interesting shop courses at that point.
Did you use any of the math or the aeronautics degrees? I mean,
Well, you know, I ended up with a degree in mathematics, and I think it's what you see in some of this is a flavoring of that. But the model airplanes and stuff that I would fly, the movement, to me, it relates to this work.
You built it from scratch?
I built them, well, sometimes they were kits, sometimes they were scratch. I had a retrospective at the Sugar University Museum in 2000. One of my model airplanes was up there. Yes.
How did you get associated with this gallery?
The curator ended up seeing my work at Heller Gallery, and I believe it was that kind of work. And she said, oh, this would be perfect for her show, the show she was thinking about. And that's Odette, who's over there on the side. She's the curator here. Odette, thank you.
Thank you. What a great, talented artist.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and what's most interesting these days, because I've been looking over, doing this archiving and seeing what I've done, and I feel like I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to live a life in the arts and to be able to just explore what I was interested in. Thank you, Julie. My wife has a regular job, she's a teacher. And so that has often been a saving grace.
From the business aspect, you're a big name now, but along the way, did you market your own work? Did you have an agent?
Heller Gallery's been selling work for years. I've had other galleries sell work. Sometimes I've sold work. It's not simple. And you know, with the jewelry, I was selling wholesale and retail. I was doing a couple of high-end craft shows, and that was interesting and fun. But at some point, I said, hey, this is not what I want to be doing, and I wanted to be more focused on the artwork, and so I gave that up. And it's not been simple. It's cost. It costs something to make that commitment. It's not simple. Anybody who's, I talk to young artists, I say, go for it. I said, do what you can, and don't expect it to be so simple. And don't expect it just because you're doing the best you can, that the whole world's going to pay attention and understand it immediately. What's interesting is this optical work with Flutex and the Murray stuff, all of a sudden is having this new attention, this rebirth in some way, that because I did the archiving, because I had these videos, the videos were online and seen around the world. And so there's a different kind of attention, understanding to that kind of movement, or because of the internet, people, it isn't so strange. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.